Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today at this Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy webinar. My name is Andy Staples, and I'm the Director of Research and Outreach at the Hinrich Foundation, based here in Singapore. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody here in Asia. It's the afternoon for those joining us in Europe. It's early morning and late at night, very early morning for those joining us for the States. And thank you for taking the time. Just before we get underway, a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. It's also being broadcast live on Facebook. We would very much encourage you to send us your questions, and please use the Q&A box that you can find at the bottom of your screen. And just a little bit of guidance there, please do keep them succinct and singular as well. We have a lot of people on this webinar, so I'd like to get through as many questions and themes as we possibly can, so I'd appreciate that. Okay, our theme today references, I think, one of the most pressing geopolitical issues of our age, namely this rivalry between the US and China. And more specifically, we seek to better understand the challenges and opportunities that this reality presents for middle powers here in Asia. Our theme also reflects, I think, the continuing impact of megatrends on the global political economy, including that shift eastwards in the world's center of economic and political power. We could also be thinking about the continuing and deepening impact of disruption from technology and innovation, and of course Asia Pacific, one of the hothouses for all of that. We could also be thinking about demographic change and so on. All of this creating the context within which great power rivalry between the US and China is playing out. And this rivalry, something that has deepened, I think most people would agree, under President Xi in China and President Trump in the United States, and given the outcome of the talks that we had last week in Alaska, shows no immediate signs of abating under President Biden. Within all of this, middle powers are increasingly facing difficult choices in a world that's less underpinned by rules and norms and more by the maxim of might is right. But also in an increasingly multipolar world, we might be able to identify some opportunities for middle powers to cooperate and even to take the lead in some areas such as climate change and trade. And to help us examine these issues today, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers to you. Now, full bios are on the website, so I'll limit my introduction just to name and affiliation, but suffice to say that we have very significant intellectual firepower at our disposal today, so I'm very much looking forward to a high quality discussion. Let me then just start off with Selina Ho, who is Assistant Professor in International Affairs at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and specializes in Chinese politics and foreign policy, with a particular focus on infrastructure politics and water disputes. Professor Ho, thank you very much for joining us. I'd then also like to introduce Professor Kong Yong Fong, who is Vice Dean, Research and Development at the Lee Kang Shing Professor in Political Science, again at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and formerly Professor of International Relations and a Professorial Fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford University. He is also an expert on US foreign policy. And finally, Dr. Alan DuPont, who's a Senior Fellow for the Hinrich Foundation and also CEO of Cognoscenti Group. Alan is one of Australia's best-known strategists, Asianologists, and thought leaders on geopolitical risk, foreign policy, defence, and national security. Alan is just about to release a new paper with us, looking explicitly at this idea of middle powers with reference to Australia, China, and the United States, which I'll come back to a little bit later on. With that introduction, with the housekeeping out of the way, we can now really get into the interesting discussion that we've lined up for you today. And to do that, I'm going to ask each of our speakers to give a few opening comments to set out some areas for investigation, some themes that we might want to dig into in a little bit more detail as we move through this webinar. My role then as moderator will be to pose follow-up questions, to bring your questions and comments into this conversation as well. So again, I do urge you to put your questions and comments in the Q&A box. I'll be going to the audience early and frequently, rather than waiting towards the end of the session for a short quick Q&A session. So we really do want to make this an interactive conversation. With that, Selina, if I could hand over to you to get your thoughts on how we define middle powers first and foremost, and also to think about the roles that they can play globally, but also with a specific focus here in Asia.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. And I'm very glad and very happy that Hinrich Foundation has co-organized this event with us. Thank you. Thank you to the foundation as well. It's my pleasure to join this panel of my colleagues and some new friends as well. Now, so let me start by talking about what roles middle powers play. And I'll give the example of Singapore to illustrate these roles. I will then talk about possible areas of cooperation between the United States and China and what middle powers can do here. Now, let me start by saying what are middle powers, right? So middle powers are those states whose sizes and capabilities are lesser than those of the great powers, but more than those of smaller states. You'll think of countries like Australia, Canada, South Korea, Japan, and then closer to home, we have Indonesia, Thailand, and Singapore as middle powers. So what kind of roles are middle powers known to have played in international politics? Just bearing in mind that middle powers actually have greater resources than smaller states, and then small states and what is known as microstates, they have a lot more resources than these, and they can call on these resources to act in international politics. First, middle powers has traditionally served as a bridge or middleman or honest broker between great powers because they are seen as more or less a neutral party. They're able to act because they are viewed as non-threatening or less threatening than the great powers. Hence, they may venture into areas where the great powers may not be able to maneuver. They also usually enjoy a higher level of trust among states in the international system, as well as among the great powers as well. Now, the other role that they play, second role they can play, is to restrain and constrain great powers because great powers need their support. Now, great powers want to win them to their side. There's no point in being a leader, a great power, without any followers. And because middle powers have resources, they are valuable followers of great powers. Now, so if great powers do not consider what middle powers want and abuse their power, middle powers will not follow them. So they act as restraints and constraints on great powers. Now, the third area that middle powers have a role in is that they usually specialize in niche areas. Now, that makes them experts in certain areas. For example, the Scandinavian countries are known to be specializing in climate change and environmental policies. Singapore in maritime industry and international law. Now, these expertise makes them valuable and respected on the world stage, and hence has credibility with great powers, and their involvement are needed if great powers hope to solve problems in these very specific areas of specialization. Now, let's take Singapore as an example of what middle powers can do. Now, Singapore has made itself useful and relevant in international politics. It is a middle power, even though it is a small state. It has a small population and territory, but it has a strong economy, a high GDP per capita, and punches above its weight in international politics. Now, these resources enabled it to project itself on the world stage. Its foreign policy is guided by a few principles, and I'm going to name just two right here. Is that first, Singapore's foreign policy is guided by the principle that it welcomes all parties to the region, meaning that Singapore is going to be friends with everyone. And number two, it will uphold international law. Well, basically because international law provides security and a basis of protection against abuses by others in the system. So Singapore can draw on have these kind of policies, and this gives it some credibility in the region. It has resources that gives it credibility in the region as well, makes it relevant to the great powers, and it is a neutral party because it is friends to everyone. Now, so it has, there are several roles it has played historically and currently as well. First, it has been an honest broker in many instances between China and Taiwan in the Wanghu talks in the 1990s, and between the Xi Jinping and Ma Ying-jeou, they held a meeting in Singapore in 2015. Between the United States and North Korea, if you remember the talks a few years back between Trump and Kim Jong-un and at Sentosa. Now, the other thing that Singapore has is that it has a deep knowledge of both China and the United States. And these countries consult our leaders on each other, especially when conversations between them actually breaks down. This is important because with greater knowledge, we can promote understanding between the great powers. When China first emerged onto the world stage in the early 1980s, Lee Kuan Yew's relationship with Deng Xiaoping was a great resource to help promote understanding between the two countries. Lee's knowledge of the United States was also a great resource for China to draw on. Now, these helps to promote understanding between the two great powers. Now, number three, Singapore provides a neutral ground for different parties to come together to discuss, explain the views, and is also an avenue for bilateral exchanges to take place. For example, by hosting the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is going to come around very soon. So this makes it valuable between the two great powers, and it acts as a bridge and honest broker, a site for discussion to improve communications between the great powers. Now, turning to the current competition between the United States and China, what are the possible areas of cooperation and where can middle powers fit into these areas of cooperation? How can middle powers help to lower tensions between the two sides, lower the level of hostility? Now, cooperation comes with shared interest. So where the two sides have shared interests, where China and the United States have shared interests, cooperation is possible. I can identify at least two areas, and then one possible areas where middle powers can try to bring the great powers together. Now, one is climate change and environmental policies. Obviously, this is an area where the Biden administration is deeply interested in and engaged in, and which China has a deep interest in as well. So this is an area where middle powers with their expertise in climate change and environmental policies can try to bridge the gap between them and bring them to the table. The other area of cooperation is North Korea. Now, this is a very difficult one and a very long-standing problem. And sometimes it actually creates more problems, and it can be very contentious for both the United States and China. But it is a possible area of cooperation because it is in both sides' interests, both the United States and Chinese interests, to have a nuclear-free North Korea. Now, in this area, Japan, South Korea can try to bridge this gap, and Singapore too, where possible. Now, a third area where middle powers have been particularly good in taking the lead is in when we come to the issue of trade agreements. So RCEP, CP, TPP are brokered by middle powers who have interest in free trade. But with all the difficulties that are turning the United States inwards and the protectionism that was part of the Trump administration, the idea was how to bring the United States back to these agreements. Now, this is an area where middle powers can try to bridge this gap. Now, it is in the areas of competence for middle powers to play any bridging role or influence technology, digital infrastructure. This is going to be the arena of competition between the two great powers in the future, moving forwards. But even then, middle powers do have a role, although not quite a bridging role. It is more like middle powers like Japan and South Korea providing an alternative between having to choose between China and the US, for instance, when it comes to things like 5G. So if the two countries like Japan and South Korea could get their networks growing and technology up to speed, then other countries, other middle powers, other smaller countries will not have to choose between China and the United States. Now, let me conclude by saying that during the pandemic, middle powers have really stepped up to act in areas where great powers failed to act. I'm thinking about keeping supply chain going, keeping trade going. So what I'm trying to say here is that middle powers have resources that they can draw on, and they can play a role in stabilizing great power rivalry, and hopefully in the process actually blunt the most damaging effects of this rivalry. Thank you. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Selina, and a wealth of points there that I'd like to come back to as we get into the discussion, and perhaps also challenge you a little bit on the role of middle powers there, because maybe some of that assumes some degree of sort of neutrality, whereas in actual fact we do see countries tilting one way or the other because of historical issues or because of trade relations and so on. So I wonder how we managed to get to that point where middle powers actually can foster cooperation, that they can be seen as more neutral grounds, given the realities today. But that's something to come back to a little bit later on. Thank you very much indeed. And now I think to bring the attention or widen the attention to Southeast Asia and more broadly Asia Pacific, I'd very much like to bring in Professor Kong to be talking about the sort of policy calculations that we see in Southeast Asia when it comes to interactions with China and the United States. And Professor Ho was talking a little bit earlier on about some of these difficult issues that we face around technology, for example. Who's going to be building your 5G network and so on? These are real sort of coming down into black and white decisions that countries might have to make. But anyway, let me take a step back and invite you, Professor Kong, to give us some idea of that policy considerations that we see within the region.
Thank you very much, Andrew. First of all, I'm like Selina, I'm very delighted to be participating in this Hinrich Foundation sponsored talk together with the LKY School. And I guess my take on middle powers will be slightly different from Selina's, in the sense that I'll be focusing on how they can protect themselves and perhaps even prosper as the rivalry between the US and China intensifies. So now if we look at the public altercation between China and the US in Anchorage last week, where the US criticized China for its human rights problems and suppression of democracy, and where China then responded by saying that the US is not qualified to deal with China from a position of strength, that has led some commentators to view those exchanges as reminiscent of Cold War interactions. I think there is something to that. The Cold War analogy is actually a good starting point, in that it emphasizes the fact that the two superpowers in Asia, with those two superpowers in Asia, we are beginning to have a bipolar situation. And in such a situation, you would expect intense competition across the board, in military security matters, in trade, in investment, as well as in the projection of soft power. Now, to be sure, the US-China competition differs from that between the US and the Soviet Union, because we have the existence of strong economic interdependence between the US and China, despite the ongoing decoupling, and China being an economic powerhouse instead of being a basket case. So this is this economic prowess, which translates to political and military power, I think, that gives China the confidence and the gumption to talk back and to challenge the US. So what does this intensifying Cold War-like full spectrum competition mean for the countries in Southeast Asia when it comes to trade, security, and interdependence? I'll say something about economic interdependence and trade first, and then move on to security. First, on the interdependence between China and the US, which most of us see as a stabilizing factor in the relationship. Now, with the trade war and the restrictions on investments, I think we're beginning to see decoupling of segments of the two economies, and I expect this to continue. The downside of this decoupling is economic as well as political strategic, in that decoupling weakens an important constraint on military conflict, including, especially including military conflict. Lesser interdependence means fewer powerful interests and voices working to protect the peace and stability, undergirding industry and economic exchange. Now, this is something that worries many in Southeast Asia, right? On the other hand, decoupling seems to be producing some positive consequences for some countries in ASEAN. What the US and China are not buying from each other, they are buying from Malaysia and Thailand. Decoupling has also led to the China Plus One strategy, where firms stay in China to sell and service the China market, but relocate outside of China to serve the rest of the world, right? Vietnam seems to be a main beneficiary of these relocations, but the other ASEAN states have not been left out. For example, setbacks in the US and in India have led WeChat's Tencent to decide to set up a regional hub in Singapore. TikTok's ByteDance is also planning to invest billions in Singapore as a result of setbacks in the US. Okay. Now, the second point I would like to make about interdependence is that interdependence within Asia, which has grown substantially. While the ASEAN countries may be reaping some benefits from US-China decoupling, they need to watch out for the possibility that they will be pressured to choose sides on economic issues. Exactly what Andrew talked about. The Huawei for 5G choice is a very good example of this. My hunch, however, is that it will be harder for the US to enlist the ASEAN countries to do its economic bidding compared to, say, NAFTA, where the US-Mexico-Canada agreement has clauses that prevent Canada and Mexico from making deals with others, right, that are disapproved by the US. And it is harder to do a similar thing with ASEAN in Southeast Asia, because in recent years, East Asia has become less dependent on exporting to the West. In other words, East Asia is integrating economically as a region. China has in fact become more important than the US as the destination for the region's exports for Southeast Asians. In other words, based on economic calculations, many in Southeast Asia see China rather than the US as the main economic opportunity of the future. China, interestingly, chooses to use this newfound economic leverage, often coercively, to get others to do its political economic bidding. Okay, finally, some thoughts on security, conceived in terms of political strategic alignments. As the US-China rivalry deepens, I think both powers will exert pressure on everyone throughout the world, but especially the Southeast Asian states, to choose between them. This has been happening in the last decade or so. Couple of thoughts here. First, most of the ASEAN states say they don't want to choose between the US and China, but this position has become increasingly difficult to maintain. And second, echoing what Andrew said, when the ASEAN countries say they don't want to choose between the two superpowers, it doesn't really mean that they are neutral or smack in the middle today. Actually, if you look carefully, I think you can say that some may have already chosen. Think Cambodia, think Laos, right? Others might have moved a bit away from the US in the last decade or so for a variety of reasons, and might have inched slightly closer to China. Perhaps Brunei, Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines. Indonesia, the biggest prize, is probably the only one smack in the middle, in my view, while Vietnam and Singapore continue to feel greater strategic comfort with the US. So what I'm trying to say is that when the ASEAN countries say they don't want to choose, they're saying that they don't want to move too far away from their current positions because they're comfortable with their current positions. Yet, it is important to note that these positions are fluid and not cast in stone. They will shift over time, and in that sense, the political strategic alignments of the majority in Southeast Asia, in my view, are up for grabs. So what are the factors that are likely to shape their choosing of sites? I would say the following three factors are key. One, the actions of the two superpowers. For example, perceptions of US staying power or Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea and so on. Second factor would be the domestic politics of the respective countries. And finally, the third factor, their perception of economic opportunities. I'll be happy to elaborate on these factors during our discussion if you have any queries. So let me end with two observations. I think it is likely that the ASEAN countries will approach choice when put to them in a rather piecemeal fashion, choosing from the menu that is available or pressed upon them. Think about Barack Obama's pivot to Asia. Think about BRI, Huawei, FOIP, RCEP, CPTPP. Through this piecemeal way of choosing of what's on offer over time, countries may wittingly or unwittingly find that they may have fallen into one camp or the other. Second, I think it is interesting to look at who is doing the cooking or who is cooking up the menu. Is it China with its AIIB, BRI, Huawei, RCEP, or is it the US with the TPP and now FOIP? The TPP was the one major initiative that the US appropriated from Brunei, Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand's initial efforts, but was unfortunately aborted as Trump's first foreign policy act. So we are left with the FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific. But if you look at ASEAN's interpretation of it, there remains a gulf between the US conception and that of ASEAN's. So in a sense, the chefs and their offerings matter. And I think it'd be interesting to think about that. I'll stop there.
Well, I was hoping that you wouldn't stop because it's fascinating to hear from you, and you're mapping out so many areas of interest for us to come back to. As you were talking about that sort of relationship between trade, dependency, and independence, a very difficult position for many countries to be in. The US is not an alternative market for many of those countries, particularly thinking about those value chains that we have spread across the region and so on. And therefore, you can really sort of come to the suggestion that trade is destiny. So a big sort of area for us to come back to. Thank you very much indeed. Now I'd like to sort of bring in Alan, Dr. Dupont. Thank you very much for joining us. And I think this is going to be a really fascinating component to this discussion. We've been talking about middle powers. We've been talking about the roles that they could play. We've been thinking about the sort of policy considerations or calculations that we see in Southeast Asia. And Professor Kong there was mapping out these areas around economic independence and trade and so on. But now we have the opportunity to come down and have a real sort of case study, I think, thinking about Australia as well, and its particular relationships that it's had with the US, with China as a middle power. But don't let me preempt you. And Alan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andy, and good evening, everybody. One of the problems of being the last speaker, of course, is all the best lines have been spoken. But I've been asked to talk about Australia as a middle power, a classic middle power by Selena's definition. And I really want to focus on economic coercion because that has become one of the defining issues for Australia and the region, and I suspect for other countries as well. And I think it highlights some of the challenges confronting middle powers in the new strategic environment we face. So let me start off with just telling you things you probably already know about Australia, but I think it's worth just remembering a few of these facts. That yes, we are a classic middle power by any definition, but we only have 25 million people. We're a relatively small population. But unusually, this population lives in a continental-sized island with the resources to match. And so that means, as a consequence, Australia has a very large economy for 25 million people, 13th largest economy in the world. And it also has a small but very capable defence force. So I think it's fair to say Australia has become a significant middle power. Now, the land down under also occupies an increasingly strategic location near the maritime crossroads of the Pacific and Indian Oceans, through which most of you know, pass 40% of global trade and 50% of any trade passes. So it's a critical part of the world. Now, unlike many middle powers, Australia is a long-standing American ally. So by no stretch of the imagination could we be called neutral in the contest between China and the United States. I think both great powers know that, but that doesn't detract from the fact that we are still a middle power, but we are an allied one with the United States. However, China has become our major trading partner over the last 20 years. And so we're in a rather unusual situation, the first time in Australian history that we've been in this situation, where our major ally is not our major trading partner. That's the first time for Australia. Now, the problem, of course, confronting us, as well as everybody else, is that both the US and China are locked in an increasingly hostile relationship, which Professor Kong has already declared has lots of characteristics that are comparable with the Cold War. In fact, I have talked about this as the new Cold War. So Australian policymakers are giving a lot of thought as to how the country can balance relations with the US and China, or indeed, and more to the point, whether it is now possible to do so. Now, the emerging consensus view in Australia is that if a choice has to be made, we are going to side with the US because our interests and values are increasingly at odds with Xi Jinping's China. Now, this feeling is by no means unanimous in Australia. There are still many who argue we shouldn't be choosing, but, and it's certainly not a cause for celebration, the fact that we are having to choose. You have to remember that 40% of our exports go to China. Much of Australia's economic growth over the past 20 years has been China driven. So the last thing we really want to do is have problems with China. But nevertheless, we are having them. And I just want to talk about why that has happened, what our experience is, and what the rest of the region can derive from it. So how have we come to this position? The short answer is that China's unprecedented trade coercion has essentially given us no choice. The problem with being a middle power when you have heightened strategic competition is there's less space to be a middle power, to be a bridge, if you like, and to benefit from a relationship with both countries. That is becoming almost impossible for Australia to do now. I would point out that China's trade coercion, while not unprecedented historically, is certainly unprecedented in the recent past. Over the last decade, there have been 152 recorded cases of Chinese economic and diplomatic coercion, affecting 27 countries. But Australia has the dubious distinction of being punished more severely by China than any other country. Relations have been, unfortunately, on a downward slide since 2015, triggered initially by Beijing's militarization of disputed islands in the South China Sea, which Australia has opposed, and also more recently attempts to interfere in Australia's domestic affairs. Now, when the Morrison government pushed back against this interference in our domestic affairs, we started to have a lot of tensions, and it's pretty clear that about a year ago, Xi Jinping decided that Australia needed to be taught a lesson. Suddenly and very abruptly, beef shipments were suspended in May last year, followed in rapid succession by a raft of disruptions to exports like coal, barley, wheat, lamb, seafood, timber, and wine. Basically, just about all our agricultural exports to China. This raft of punitive measures has cost Australian exporters $20 billion in lost revenue and plunged the bilateral relationship with China into a deep freeze. Now, the question is, why is China punishing Australia? Bluntly stated, we're being punished for failing to kowtow and acknowledge China's hegemony in Asia, using a tactic known colloquially as kill the chicken to scare the monkey. Xi Jinping can't afford to have small nations defy him because, in his mind, this would undermine China's authority and position in the world. Some of you may recall, at least a decade ago, when then China's Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi made it abundantly clear how China regards its neighbours. He said, a famous quote, "China is a big country and other countries are small countries, and that's just a fact." That was declared, if I recall, at the 2011 ASEAN Regional Forum in Hanoi. Now, Australia is now seen by China as an acute risk, as an influential democratic middle power, close ally of the United States. Xi appears that Canberra's defiance could embolden others to resist his mix of blandishments and heavy-handed coercion, leading to the emergence of an anti-China coalition that could threaten his expansive ambitions. But this is exactly what is happening, as middle powers are starting to coalesce around a raft of emerging formal and informal security arrangements and understandings that are clearly responses to China's coercion. NATO is the most recent example, only today. So, three quick conclusions can be drawn from, I think, Australia's experience. First, there is an inverse relationship between coercion and independence. Xi's use of economic pressure for geopolitical ends would have been far less effective if Australia had not allowed itself to be seduced by the vast promise of the China market. Second, codependency reduces vulnerability to economic coercion, but not as much as trade diversification. A potential Chinese boycott of iron ore exports would devastate the Australian economy, but China hasn't done that because of the interdependence of the two economies. It would be a serious act of economic self-harm to China's critical manufacturing sector if it were to cease importing iron ore from Australia, which produces 60%, exports 60% provides 60% of China's imports of iron ore, and there are no immediate substitutes. My third point is that China's leaders seem prepared to sustain trade pressure on countries like Australia for a long time, provided the economic costs are less than the geopolitical gain. Okay, so my final point is this: what can middle powers do to preserve their independence and freedom of action in the face of great power coercion? Well, first of all, let's rule out autarky. It's prohibitively expensive and doesn't work, as North Korea regularly reminds us. Protectionism accelerated the march to war in the 1930s. It is the antithesis of free trade and won't resonate with trading nations which need open markets. Emulating China would expose the world to a power-based trading system where the strong do what they want and the weak suffer what they must. In my view, a better approach is proactive diplomacy in cooperation with like-minded countries to resist coercion. If middle powers can come together in an interlocking but differentiated set of arrangements, partnerships, and understandings, this would make it much more difficult for great powers to pick off smaller countries at will. There is no point in pushing for freer and fairer trade without a supporting infrastructure of enforceable rules that penalise the weaponisation of trade by dirigist states. The much maligned Donald Trump deserves credit for exposing China's unfair trade practices and cynical manipulation of WTO rules. But Trump erred in paralysing the WTO's dispute resolution mechanism and withdrawing from the high standard Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. These were own goals which have been ruthlessly exploited by Xi, making it more difficult for middle powers to defend against China's power trading and promote the virtues of trade liberalisation. Countering China's power trading will require a broad coalition of middle powers, but the structure must be sufficiently flexible to accommodate more agile institutional arrangements and allow middle powers to contribute according to their ability and appetite for risk. If the coalition is to have teeth, non-democracies must be included, since they comprise most of the world's developing states. Many have been on the receiving end of China's power trading, debt diplomacy, and intrusive nationalism. Developing countries may not be prepared to put their head above the parapet in the cause of free and open trade, but given a choice, most will support rules that protect the interests of smaller economies. None of this should be construed as a strategy for containing China, a political and economic impossibility given its size and strategic weight. However, and conclude with this remark, countering China's coercive diplomacy and power trading is a necessary defensive measure to protect the prosperity and security of every nation that values its sovereignty and an open trading system. Thank you very much.
Alan, thank you very much for that comprehensive overview there as well. And again, a lot of key issues for us to dig into, and I want to dive straight in. I do see questions are coming in, and I would encourage people to put those in. I'll be looking through those as we continue. But I want to come back to Professor Kong. You were talking earlier on about perceptions, and Alan there was mapping out trade coercion that Australia has seen from China, but there are other economies in the region that have faced that as well. Singapore's been in the bad books occasionally with China as well. I'm thinking about the confiscation of military equipment on the way back from Taiwan, I think it was in Hong Kong a few years back, for example. But at the same time, and again there, Alan referenced Trump and his policies. They've also seen the United States under President Trump step away from its traditional support of that multilateral trading system of a rules-based institutions that have supported the globalization that we've grown up with over the past 40, 50 years or so. So coming back to this question of perceptions, we can think about the theories, but we can also see the realities that have been playing out over the past few years. How is that shaping perceptions about dealing with China and America today in the corridors of power of Southeast Asia, do you think?
Okay. I think the perception in Southeast Asia is that I think there was a question about whether geography or history or culture matters more. I had a look at some of the questions, and I think I can link this to the question.
Please, yeah.
A little bit. And so I think it has a lot to do with geography, partly because China is the permanent resident of Asia in a way that the US is not. The US, of course, is an Asian Pacific power, but the US is there by choice. And of course, a very important, the hegemon actually of the region. So in that sense, one of the calculations that the Southeast Asian countries will have to make is US staying power. All right. I mean, you don't, they assume China will be around forever, but they have to make some estimations or perceptions of US staying power. And during the Trump years, they were very confused because the Trump administration did not seem to be particularly concerned about, let's say, Southeast Asia or East Asia, with the annoying of the allies and not coming to ASEAN meetings, the ARFs, ASEAN summits, and so on. So there was a sense of a US disengagement. And if this had carried on, I think the perception will be, can you rely on the US, right? So, but with the Biden administration and the appointment of key officials who are very Asian focused, I think it has restored some optimism. If you look at the most recent Institute of Southeast Asian study of ASEAN attitudes in Southeast Asia, it's very interesting that the belief in America as a positive force in Asia has grown compared to the previous assessments. So that's one positive thing. However, the fact that 75 million Americans actually voted for Trump, despite his losing, does make some ponder, both in Asia and I think in Europe, as to what happens after Biden. So that calculation will also be at the top of their minds, because if it turns out that we have a Trump-like president who is more strategic, then in fact we may return to a situation where the US will be less engaged in Asia, all right, along Trumpian lines, America first kind of policy, and that may shape calculations as to how far one can side with the Americans, in the next 4 years or so, while thinking about the long term.
Yeah, this time frame is a really interesting issue, isn't it? We're on a US electoral cycle, presidential cycle, for example. It's not something that that China needs to be concerned about. Professor Ho, I wonder if I could come back to you and keep just for a moment on this idea of perceptions and also thinking about choices. Alan there was outlining the need for like-minded countries to come together to resist trade coercion and so on. One of your specialist areas is Chinese politics and foreign policy as well. I wonder if you could give us a sense from sort of Beijing's perspective, looking out at the rest of the world, thinking about relationships with middle powers, and particularly here within the region. What do you think is guiding China's foreign policy in that sense? And one of the reasons I ask that is because if we look at some of the perceptions of countries, there was the Pew survey out some time ago looking at trust. I think one of the questions was in a global survey of China, which has plummeted in many countries and many of the economies that we've been talking about, the middle powers as well. So is their foreign policy working? How can middle powers act to constrain China, or maybe not constrain China, but help it, nudge it towards a more cooperative stance towards middle powers?
Okay.
And I realize there was quite a lot in there, so please do focus in on one or two points. Yeah.
Okay, let me first respond by your original comment about neutrality. I just want to say that neutrality is not that countries don't have a side. Countries usually have a side, but that they would prefer not to choose sides. And I think Australia is a slightly unique case here, as Alan was talking about. I think if you were to think back about Australia in the 1990s or the 2000s, not currently, this is when I think Australia, while being an ally of the United States, was actually trying to keep relations with China, and even kill for exactly economic benefits, right? Economic trade and investments and all that. It's the same that's happening with South Korea and Japan. I mean, they are allies of the United States, but they are really trying to not antagonize China too much in order to, because of the trade and relations between them. So these are the considerations that middle power have when it comes to neutrality. There is the desire to be as much as neutral as possible. Obviously, neutrality cannot be absolute. And there will be middle powers who are more neutral than others. I mean, you can think of Indonesia, as Yuan Feng said, that is right in the middle. Now, as to your question of what is happening with Chinese foreign policy, I think one of the things that we need to know about Chinese foreign policy, I think they have decided that their time has arrived. That is what drives it. And I think in Xi Jinping's world, that is the legacy he wants to leave, who want to leave behind when eventually he needs to step down. It is very obvious in the past, before 2008, before the global financial crisis, it is very rare for Chinese diplomats to think about lecturing Americans. But one of my trips in 2009, right after the global financial crisis, I was doing my grad studies then, and I was on a school trip, and we went to visit, I can't remember which agency now, but we were essentially, I was with the American group because I was studying in the States. And we were essentially being told that you shouldn't be doing this and you shouldn't be doing that, lecturing. So I think the what is driving Chinese foreign policy is that the West has weakened. It's very clear. You keep saying that the East is on the rise while the West is in decline. It's very open about this. So it is what is driving Chinese foreign policy is that it believes that its moment has arrived. Whether it is indeed the moment, we can't tell right now. There are voices within China that caution against such a perspective. But this is a perspective that is not driving the government per se. The other voices that say we should be cautious, we have not really arrived, and we should not show our hands too soon. we should still do what Deng Xiaoping told us to do, which is to not show too early our hand, and to keep a low profile. But I think that's something that is not driving Xi Jinping or the foreign policy establishment. Now, trust has definitely plummeted among middle powers. It's not just the Pew survey, but ISIS in Singapore, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, that is in NUS, and Yuan Feng will always say, I like to cite those studies. I have been looking at their annual surveys from 2019 to 20, and the last one. So they have been collating information for 3 years in a row now. So the latest report was in January, and you can see the trend of trust among ASEAN countries. This is about ASEAN countries, a survey of ASEAN countries. So the trend of distrust has actually increased over the years. And this is despite all the goodwill that China has trying to dole out in terms of BRI, in terms of all the loans and aid and vaccines and all that. Those things are not quite working. So I mean, that is definitely true. So your last question is their foreign policy working, and how can middle powers act to nudge China to a more cooperative stance? I mean, that's a difficult one, because I think their foreign policy is actually it's not quite working in a direction that they want. I think they will continue to face a lot of uphill battles. The countries that have actually essentially thrown in their lot with China has been, smaller states in the developing world. They are facing, countries like Cambodia, which, in their conception, have little choices in how to choose, because, well, I can understand where Cambodians are coming from. They see China as the security guarantor, not just an economic guarantor, but a security guarantor against Thailand and Vietnam. Yeah. So this is the kind of views that they have internally within Cambodia. So how can middle powers act to constrain or nudge China to cooperate? I think that's a difficult one. I think one of the important things is to keep the conversation going, to continue to try to engage them in multilateral platforms in ASEAN, getting them to come to Shangri-La dialogue, offering and really trying their best not to take sides. I mean, that is a space that is increasingly narrowing for all the middle powers, for Singapore as well. So I mean, I think it's difficult, but I think you have to keep on doing the things that we have been doing, which is to engage them in multilateral forums and to do their best to communicate. I think that's one of the key things that will help us.
That issue of communication and so on, I think, is crucial. Earlier, you mentioned that very positive relationship between Deng Xiaoping and Lee Kuan Yew here, but that was a different era. And do you get the sense that China is willing to listen and to learn, or conversely, as you said, has arrived and has no need to hear from anybody else? And Alan's quoting earlier on that some countries are big, some are small. Get used to it.
Well, that Yang Jiechi's statement was actually with reference to Singapore. He was referring to George Yeo at the meeting, our former foreign minister. Actually, I think that China is not willing to listen now. And in a way, it is not unusual for great powers to do that. I mean, when China was emerging, it was willing to learn from the West. I mean, if you think about the 1980s, right? I mean, that was when China, the relationship with the United States was blossoming. That was until Tiananmen happened, and they realized the dangers of what was happening with this open door policy, right? So there was this desire to learn that has been going for many years, but I think this is a time where it is a great power. And to be frank and to be honest, all great powers don't really listen. This is the same for the United States. To be fair to China, this is the classical behavior of great powers. They don't really listen to other people. So, I mean, chances of China listening is going to be hard. Both the United States and China are actually tone deaf to the concerns of other countries. They only care about themselves.
On that was a very, very good point. I mean, there's so many unfilled seats under the last US administration. Earlier session with David Shambo and another one with Clive Prestwich to talk about the need for the US to come and talk to people and to listen, particularly here in Southeast Asia, and to learn more. And you get the sense that there would be particularly thinking about the region and membership, as Professor Kuan was talking about, of CPTPP, of RCEP, and so on. Wanting the US to be more engaged as a balance towards China and so on. I'm going to change gears a little bit now and come to some of the questions. We got 2 or 3 there talking about Myanmar, and actually, interestingly, is Myanmar, the crisis that we have there, is this an opportunity for middle powers to act as a sort of go-between between the United States and China as well? The very complex relationship between Myanmar and China, of course. Myanmar being an ASEAN member, we haven't heard too much from ASEAN at the moment, plenty from the States and from Europe and elsewhere. But is this an opportunity for middle powers, and particularly thinking about those powers in ASEAN economies, to realize some positive progress in Myanmar? Who would like to take that one? But Professor Kong, could I come to you on that?
Why don't I start with take a crack at it?
Yep.
I don't see it as an opportunity for ASEAN at all. It's something that they probably hope, had not materialized at all. And in Asia, there's this saying that never fail to make an opportunity of a crisis. This is not one where they will look at it this way. And although ASEAN has probably been much more soft-spoken than the rest of the world on this issue, because they want to preserve the little that they can do to nudge the junta around, to nudge the junta to do some, to use less force and to come up with an eventual peaceful solution. So I think the ASEAN leaders know that they have very limited leverage on the co-leaders, and I think they are very careful about where they can go. Although the president of Indonesia, Jokowi, has asked for a meeting of the heads of ASEAN, the leaders of ASEAN, in order to make an approach or to discuss the Myanmar situation. But I'm not very optimistic about what ASEAN can do in this particular case.
Okay, Alan, you're on mute, Alan, but if you'd like to come in on that one.
Yeah, Andy, I'd like to just come in on that question, but I'd also like to pick up on a few of the earlier comments that were made. So just quickly on Myanmar, I agree entirely with Professor Kong that I think Southeast Asian states, ASEAN states, have very limited leverage. The countries that have most leverage are obviously China, and actually those big investors such as Japan and India actually have more economic clout. Now, I don't think any of that's going to matter. I think it's what China thinks is going to be the deciding factor in how this how the situation plays out in Myanmar over the next few months. And I'm not very optimistic about the outcome, to be frank. But if I could just take the opportunity just to make a few other comments. Okay, the first thing is I find it fascinating, having spent a big chunk of my life living in Southeast Asia and having talked to many Southeast Asians about their attitudes to the Americans, that at any given point in time, the dominant view seems to be not enough America, and then it's too much America. And I've often asked the question, so what is the sort of ideal balance you would like? And I never get a definitive answer on that, probably because there isn't one. So the point I'm making here is that I would say that most Southeast Asians see the absolute necessity of having the United States in Asia as the only country capable of balancing China's power, particularly now when China has become probably more powerful than it's been for 140 years, right? But I think that the real issue here for the whole world, and particularly for the region, is the nature of the Chinese state. So this is not your ordinary great power conflict between the United States and China. It's intensely ideological, and it's about values as well as interests. It's a systemic issue, right? So the question is really not whether we choose the United States over the China or vice versa. The question is, what sort of region do we want to see, and what will be the values and interests that bind us? Do we want a world in which might is right? I think the answer to that for most of us, smaller powers, is no, we don't. So you have to have a rules-based system, but China clearly is not only changing the rules, but it's seeking to use its power to achieve its objectives in ways that I think are probably quite unacceptable to most countries. Now, the problem for smaller states is if you put your head above the parapet, as I said before, like Australia has done, you get a very big hammer come down on top of you. And so a lot of countries are probably looking at Australia and thinking, well, if that's what's happened to Australia, worse could happen to us. So therefore, we're not going to be publicly taking a position on a lot of these issues, whether it's the South China Sea, whether it's trade coercion, whatever. But as Selena said before, that doesn't mean that Southeast Asian countries are neutral. They have views. And I think it's very interesting when you talk to Southeast Asians, pretty much including countries that are not necessarily democratic, the view is that the primary aim for all small middle powers in the region is to retain your autonomy of action, foreign policy and trade action. You want your independence. You don't want to be coerced or dictated to by any great power, whether it's the United States or China. And the problem is that right at the moment, China is the great power that's causing problems for everyone else because of the way it's behaved over the last couple of years. So that to me is the critical question. All right, anyway, look, I think I've said enough on that. So I just wanted to get those points out there.
Thank you. And just while you're there, because when you were sharing some thoughts earlier on, there was a lot of ifs in there. You know, ifs, powers can come together. What's your sort of prognosis looking forward, looking at these issues? We've got the reality of a big and a growing Chinese economy. It's a known quantity. We know the thinking, or we see the practice of Chinese tech. We know the United States as well. What is the prospect for middle powers, including Australia and elsewhere within Southeast Asia, to be drawing together a little bit more closely, as you suggest, to push back against trade coercion, drawing it together a little bit more closely to pull in the United States to free trade agreements and so on? If you were to give that a sort of, 10 very likely, 1 highly unlikely, where are we?
Okay, look, I hate to be pessimistic, but I think we're going to see much more of a bifurcated world in the future, hence the analogy with the first Cold War. I don't think it's going to be as clear cut as the first Cold War, where you had 2 competing blocs. One was essentially democratic and the other was more authoritarian. It's going to be much more, I think someone referred to this earlier on, a suite of options that countries will choose. For example, what telecommunication system do you want? Do you want to have Huawei as your core infrastructure, or do you specifically not want to have Huawei? Now, it's quite interesting to see which way countries are going on this. So it's going to be much messier, much more difficult to choose. And it's not about the infrastructure. It's about the rule setting that goes with it. And China worked out 20 years ago that the reason the US and the West was able to dominate world affairs for so long is not so much because of the institutions and the infrastructure and their developed economies, because they were the rules maker for the world, whether in trade, commerce, geopolitics, the rules maker. So China wants to change the rules. The problem that I have with that is not that they want to change the rules, but I'm not sure what sort of rules they want to actually impose, because China's rules, from what I have seen, are quite contrary to the sorts of values and rules that I would want to see in this world. Now, if you ask Southeast Asians that question, I would think the majority of Southeast Asians would have comparable views to me on the sort of world they want to see. They want a world of rules and laws, because that protects smaller states from great power coercion. And by the way, the US was responsible for some of this too under Trump. It's not that Trump was a shining angel of virtue. So one of the problems we had over the last 4 years, there was not much to choose between Trump's America and Xi Jinping's China. Now, I think that's going to change with Biden in the chair, because he's much more a traditional Democrat president. He's a consensus person. He's made it very clear to everybody that he wants to rebuild alliances. Now, here's the other point I wanted to make. Now, this is going to be a US-led pushback of democracies primarily, but smaller countries are going to have to make a decision about whether they're going to be supportive of where Biden wants to go with this, or whether they're going to oppose it, or whether they're going to bandwagon with China, as Cambodia and Laos have done, and perhaps Myanmar will too. So I think ASEAN is going to be split on these questions. And I think you're going to get quite nuanced positions by individual countries in Southeast Asia. There will not be a one ASEAN view about this. I mean, there never really has been, whether it's on Myanmar, but certainly on this big question. Every country will work out its own options. And so my core argument is this: if you want to bring like-minded countries on board, you have to, first of all, make sure it's not seen as an anti-China coalition. That would be a big mistake. It's a coalition of like-minded countries in support of the rule of law and free and open trade. That is the way I would pitch it, and a lot of countries would sign on to that.
Okay, very much. I don't know, Selina or Professor Kong, if you had any comment that you wanted on that theme. Okay, I'm going to look into the questions then. Quite a few questions there around India as well. India is a country that you haven't really touched on, but of course, a huge population, a growing economy. In fact, probably looking forward, after we get the recoveries from COVID, India will be growing at a faster rate than China, very different structures and so on. Can I get your thoughts and comments on the role of India? We've also got India as part of the Quad. We're thinking about Indo-Pacific and so on. Professor Kong, if I could come to you on the role of India within this. And just to note that you're on mute there. There we go.
India has been actually quite reluctant to participate actively in the Quad until I think the troubles with China in the last 1 year. And I think as a result of that, I think you can see India being a much more willing participant in the Quad. And so this Quad idea, I think, does suggest that India is going to, play a much more active role in sort of countering China's activities in the region. So in that sense, this coalition of democracies seems to be gathering force, and this may be the result of what has been happening in the region in the last 10 years. However, India's economic growth, people have been speculating in the last 20 years that in the end, it will beat China's rate of growth, but that has yet to happen. So I think a lot will also depend on how the investment situation and how solid the economic growth will be in the years ahead, because India does have its own internal issues that it has to deal with.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Ho, please, yeah.
Maybe I can add to that about India. I think that it's quite clear from the latest meeting among the courts that that India is going to be playing a pivotal role, especially when it comes to competing with China in terms of vaccines. It's going to be produced how many billion? A billion doses for developing countries and making them available. So that is one angle to look at. But I just want to say that historically, the United States have always had these hopes about India, that India will play this role of balancing and being a bigger, a democracy, a large democracy, the world's largest democracy, actually, playing a balancing role in this region. But traditionally, it has been quite disappointed. Maybe under Modi, with his more, muscular type of foreign policy, that might change. And actually, in this region, I think that Singapore, for one, would want to see India playing a greater role and putting meat in things like Act East instead of just, being rhetorical, but actually not just playing a role in the Quad, but having a more active economic involvement in this part of the world. So this is one thing. Now, but Professor Kong is right in a sense that the idea that the thing that could hamper India is actually internally, right? It is still a very poor country. Yes, it's a whole slew of economic problems, and and not to mention the problems where you can see the country turning less democratic, and this could be a concern if you talk about a coalition of democracies in the Quad. I don't know how that will play out, but that will be, I think, one of the factors that impact on India's role in the region. But we certainly, from the region's perspective, we definitely hope that India will play a more robust role in the region.
Okay, lots of questions. We're just not going to be able to get to them, but as we move towards time, we've got about 6 minutes left. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to imagine a situation where they could sit down with and have a cup of tea with Xi Jinping, or with the heads of the ASEAN states, or a cup of coffee with Joe Biden. What would be your key piece of advice? And Professor Kong, I'm going to lead with you if I can, to sit down with Joe Biden. Alan, to sit down with the heads of ASEAN states, and Selina, Professor Ho, sitting down with Xi Jinping. So, Professor Kong, if I could come to you in about 1 minute, if you could, what would be your key tips?
I would say do everything that Trump did not do, which is principally to reassure your allies. Don't ask them to pay 5 times more, what it costs for the US to station troops on your territory. In a sense, to go back to the good old days, the traditional approach to alliances and so on, and come to all the meetings, like the East Asian Summit and things of that sort. And most importantly, find a way to come back to CPTPP, because that would be pretty central. I mean, you can ask for certain revisions, make a deal with your good friend Japan, and because without that economic engagement and being economically central to East Asia, I think it'll be very hard to compete with China, which will be so economically preponderant in East Asia in the years ahead.
Thank you very much, and I hope somebody from Washington is on the line and listening to you. So thank you for that. And Alan, then, if I could come to you, heads of state of ASEAN economies.
Well, I think the last thing the ASEAN heads of state would want to hear from an Australian giving them advice about how to deal with the region. But however, since you've asked me to do it, I would, of course, very diplomatically suggest to the ASEAN heads of state that you have had a lot of experience dealing with a powerful China in your history, but now you've got a powerful China and a still powerful United States contesting for preeminence globally, and particularly in this part of the world. So you need to rethink your policy settings. And the first thing is, I would just advise you not to become too dependent on economic and trade with China, as Australia has done, because look at what happened to us. It reduces your capacity for independence. You want to diversify your trade links. Of course, China is going to continue to be an important investor and a trading partner, but don't put all your eggs in the China basket, because there is a price to pay, and it's not just a dollar price, okay? It can cost you your freedom of action and maneuver, and nobody wants that. So that would be my second piece of advice. And the third piece of advice would be, you want to keep the US engaged in the region, because if the US decides that it's going to get out of the region, which I don't think it will, but if it ever did decide that, and Trump came close to that, the big losers would be Southeast Asia, because you wouldn't have a balancer. Nobody else can balance China. And that's why Australians have an alliance with the US, not because we subordinated our foreign policy to the US, as a lot of critics say. It's because it's in our interest to have that balance, and it certainly is in Southeast Asia. That would be my final point I would say is this, and sometimes this upsets some of my colleagues in the region, but everything can't be seen through the ASEAN lens. The individual countries of Southeast Asia need to think beyond ASEAN in terms of protecting their core interests. I'm not to say you're ditching ASEAN as a core part of your foreign policy sort of persona, if you like, but ASEAN is split markedly on China. And so you're never going to get an ASEAN consolidated position on virtually anything, any of these difficult issues. So therefore, Southeast Asian countries are going to have to act more individually or in coalitions of the willing within ASEAN or outside ASEAN. That's how I'd be thinking about it.
Thank you very much. And finally, just in the last minute, Professor Ho, if I could come to you, put yourself in the shoes of Lee Kuan Yew talking to Deng Xiaoping. It's your opportunity to speak.
Those shoes, thank you. Gave me the hardest task, actually. Okay, so if I imagine that I'm talking to Xi Jinping, I'll probably say three things to him. First of all, that China has a right to a seat among the great powers. I think that's a reassurance. And I think a lot of the actions that China is taking now, other than the fact that they think the moment has arrived, is the fact that I think in international organizations, in many instances, I think they felt that the system, while benefiting them, there was parts of the system that did not recognize that they have that kind of power, that their seat is not commensurate, right? So this is what happens, right? When wars break out in World War II, Germany did not feel that, not that I'm suggesting that's going to be the same scenario coming out, but I think there is a need to tell, I mean, if I'm someone powerful sitting next to him, I would want to tell him that you have a right to a seat in accordance with your power. I think that's the first step. The second one is that I would remind him that apart from big powers, or G2 relationship, which China wanted to propose, smaller powers should not be, that there is more than just great powers, and there's more than just the United States. That there are a whole slew of other smaller states that you need to consider and to listen to, because if you do not, then you're going to find that you are going to be alone, or you're going to be standing with a group of states that are not as powerful or as developed or as rich as you want them to be, because what you want to do is to win people over to your side. And coercion is not the best way to deal with smaller powers. And I think the third one, I mean, related to the second point, is that diplomacy needs to be more subtle. It is not about the naked display of power. I think that's one of the things that China has forgotten. The art of diplomacy. I mean, you talk about the wolf warriors, and that's among the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman and all that. That has something to do with the nationalism that is growing within China, and that's also pushing the leadership to take some of these hardline stands. But I think there is a need to return to a more subtle and more sophisticated form of diplomacy, and not to have these naked displays of power, which will obviously not win you friends. I think that those are the three things I probably would say. Thanks.
Well, very sound advice on which to bring this webinar to an end. There are so many questions that we couldn't get to, and there's so many areas that I wanted to dig into more. But as ever, with these webinars, we've got a limited period of time, and I'd like to thank everybody for dialing in, for sending their questions. I hope you found this as an engaging discussion as I have. Thank you very much. There's clearly a lot there that we need to keep our eyes on in the coming weeks, months, and years as we look at the political economy, the global political economy, and specifically here within the region, and how middle powers navigate between the great powers as well. Finally, just to remind everybody that this is recorded. You'll find a recording of this on the websites. I would also like to draw people's attention to the paper that Alan mentioned earlier on, De-risking the Cold War, the new Cold War, I should say, which is available on hinrichfoundation.com, and a new paper that Alan's just releasing at the moment, looking at Australia, China, and the United States. Will be up very shortly as well on the same website. Finally, thank you to all of our guests, Professor Selina Ho, Professor Kong Yong Fong, and Dr. Alan Dupont for their time and input today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you on another event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.